Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Parallel Deku, back with another fanfiction. This is the third part of What If Deku and Bakugou Were Cellmate? Now before starting, please give this video a like. And subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Why the hell did you say you would resign? Katsuki didn't outwardly react to his mate's outrage. The Omega had remained silent the entire ride back from Plus Ultra, failing to so much as look at Bakugou. Only now that the pair had made it into the elevator of their building did Izuku have the audacity to question Katsuki's actions. We're not discussing this. The same way they didn't seem to discuss anything important nowadays. Like how the hell Izuku knew All Might or what the two men had spoken about. First half and half, now All Might. At this point, Katsuki didn't want to know why Izuku knew all these other pro-heroes. Or, more accurately, he didn't want to ask about it, only to be denied any information. Finally, the elevator chimed as it reached their floor. Katsuki quickly stepped out into the hallway, his keys in his hands and soon in the door. Of course we're discussing this. This wasn't the first time Katsuki had seen Izuku upset, but it was the first time the Alpha had encountered his Omega in such a livid state. As soon as the door closed behind Katsuki, Izuku let loose. How could you even consider resigning? Izuku yelled in exasperation. Katsuki would sigh if he didn't think that would further upset his mate. He couldn't comprehend how Izuku didn't understand their situation. How did he not get that Katsuki's resignation was the only viable option? There was no fking way we were going along with that other plan. We don't have any other choice. That pissed Katsuki off. We do, the Alpha pressed the words with his certainty, and I'm choosing it. I'm resigning and that's all there is to it. How could you resign? The Omega pressed his tee up against Katsuki's, an abnormally challenging stance for the noticeably shorter man. You've been saying you'd be the #1 hero since we were toddlers, you can't give up now. Giving up? Is that what Izuku was upset about? His fking career. Katsuki fking loved his job. He was in this stupid situation because of his job. He'd still be single if he hadn't needed an Omega to please the powers that be. There were few things that mattered to Bakugou more than being the #1 pro-hero, and Izuku was one of them. I'm not giving you up. Katsuki jabbed his index finger into the other man's shoulder with enough force to make Izuku stumble away from him. I just found you. I love you too much to lose you again. The repulsed look on his mate's face made the BLD rush to Katsuki's head. Why do you keep saying that like it's nothing? Katsuki stared at the Omega without comprehension. What are you talking about? How can you say that you love me? The Alpha's mind went completely blank. The few thoughts he did have fell instantly from his mouth. What? You said you wanted to be mates. I never said that I loved you. And with that everything changed. In a single sentence, every embrace, every touch, every word spoken between the two mates turned into lies. All of it had been lies. Smoke escaped between the clenched fingers of Katsuki's right hand while sparks from miniature explosions were visible in his left. But you wanted to be mates. You don't have to be in love to become mates. The FCK you don't. The Omega's eyes opened just a bit wider before he appraised his mate. Izuku sighed in a mix of exasperation and disapproval. Kacchan, be serious. You can't possibly think you love me. I don't fking think I do, I know I do. Izuku threw his hands up, obviously agitated. We've only known each other for a month or bullshit. Katsuki growled. You can't act like that we didn't know each other before. That we don't have history. Katsuki shut his mouth with a snap, quickly averting his eyes to stare at no spot in particular on the ceiling. They'd never talked about their past. Not since Bakugou told Itsuki the story of his childhood friend. Apologizes prepared over many years fell to the wayside as the crazy events of the present absorbed all their attention and energy. It wasn't that Katsuki didn't remember all the horrible things he'd done to his mate as children. He certainly didn't feel less guilty about it since he'd found out Izuku's true identity. Now was as good a time as any to finally atone for his regrets. Izu, not, Deku, Kacchan. Izuku interrupted in a surprisingly quiet whisper. Didn't you say you couldn't love me because you were already in love with someone else? With him. The Alpha looked down to meet the judgment already cast in emerald eyes and tried to ignore the chill that ran through his body. That was before I knew that I was talking to you. I always loved you. You loved Deku, your childhood friend. Izuku smiled sadly. But that person's not me. You're not in love with me, Kacchan. I don't even know the person you're in love with anymore. Katsuki tried to speak, but Izuku didn't allow it this time. What did you discover about me after I died? What did you love about me when I was suddenly not around? What idyllic Deku did you create in your head when I wasn't there to ruin the image? Izuku took a step closer and Katsuki stepped back. The Omega came to a halt and kept his head to one side. Katsuki forced himself to maintain eye contact, but his body demanded he escape this conversation. There was so much Katsuki wanted to say, so much to explain. But the words wouldn't come. Worse yet, he was trapped in Izuku's disappointed gaze. You want to know why I wanted us to be mates, Kacchan? The Alpha didn't respond, but Izuku took the silence as a sign to continue. Because you aren't the same person either. I could tell from the moment you visited me in my cell that something had changed since the last time I saw you. But it took me a long time to fight against what experience told me to be true. You're an Alpha. Alpha by instinct need to exert their power and superior class over those weaker than them. They do and take what they want when they want it. That's what you were like long before you even presented. Back then I was blinded by that power. I was amazed by your quirk, your strength of personality. I was dazzled by everything that you were. Even when you were cruel or when you hurt me, I worshipped you like I worshipped all the other heroes. But then I learned that all heroes are human. Even the strongest have flaws, and I'm not only talking about physical weaknesses. Izuku turned away, but Katsuki could see the tears welling up in his eyes. I thought you were the same. Then you proved me wrong. You made me feel safe. You took care of me and I thought, the words cut off roughly. I realized that you were so different from the person I remembered and I thought, maybe I can be different too. Maybe with you, I could change from the person I'd become. The room went silent. Eventually, when Izuku finally turned to look back at Katsuki, there was a vulnerability in his eyes. But, otherwise, his face was expressionless. On the contrary, Katsuki's face twisted in pain. So it was all about you then. Izuku looked like he'd been slapped. Maybe now he knew how Katsuki felt. I made you feel safe. Katsuki continued, his heart aching. I take care of you. FCK, you didn't need to make me for any of that SHT, Izuku. Don't you get it? That's what you deserve. None of that SHT is special, it's the bare minimum. If that's all you wanted from our mating, then FCK that. Bakugou turned on his heel and began walking toward the front door. Don't settle for the first fucking Alpha that treats you decently. We can go ahead and get the license revoked like Sir Night Eye said if that's how you really feel. Kacchan, where are you going? Alpha ignored the pain in his mate's voice. You can stay here until Plus Ultra holds up their end of the deal and finds you a new place. You won't have to see me again. Kacchan, you can't go. Please, don't leave me here alone. I can't. Katsuki made it to the door before he stopped, hand on the doorknob. Izuku's sobs echoed in the Alpha's ears and instinct demanded that Katsuki return to comfort his mate. But Izuku wouldn't be his mate for much longer. Bakugou couldn't bear to turn around, but he did force himself to scowl so Izuku could see him. You'll be fine, Deku. Next time, find an Alpha you actually care about before you fucking string them along. Katsuki yanked open the door, but couldn't stop himself from adding one last piece of advice for the man he loved. What the hell do you want to change anyway? There's nothing fucking wrong with you, at least to me. I wouldn't change a DMN thing. The door slammed shut behind him. As soon as Katsuki entered the elevator, he realized he had no place to go. The minute he walked out those doors, he would be swarmed by reporters and photographers. If he went out there with those assholes now, the Alpha would most certainly do or say things that would do more than ruin his image. They'd probably land him in jail. Trapped in his condo building, Katsuki didn't have many choices of where to go. He jabbed the button to the storage floor and closed his eyes. FCK, Katsuki felt drained. He felt cheated. How could he have been so naive, so trusting? He knew the answer to that. Because it was Izuku. The Omega had been so easy to read, even when he kept his secrets close to his Why would Bakugou question his mate's intentions? Katsuki had felt that something was wrong when Izuku asked for them to become mates, but the pro-hero had ignored it. He'd pushed his gut feelings aside because Izuku had offered everything Katsuki had ever wanted, Izuku himself. Izuku was right, he never said he loved Katsuki. He said he wanted to try to be mates for real. But to Katsuki, being real mates meant love. It meant that this was a two-way street where they both fucking cared about each other. Instead, his initial instinct had been correct. Katsuki was convenient, and that's why Izuku wanted him as a mate. When the elevator door opened, he immediately stepped forward and punched the metal cage of the nearest storage locker. The large crate shook but was surprisingly sturdy. Katsuki punched it again, then again and again. He punched it with his only good fist until the sharp edges of the metal cage pierced his skin. The alpha stopped when he saw BLD and swore loudly to an empty floor. He fell into a squat, his elbows propped onto his knees and his head in his hands. His eyes burned, but he had to regain focus. Katsuki couldn't stay in the storage area forever. He had to figure out where he'd sleep tonight or however long it took to find Izuku a place of his own. The first thought was a hotel, but Katsuki would be recognized instantly. Infamous pro-hero ground zero checks into a hotel alone. He wouldn't give those assholes the satisfaction of a scandalous headline. Second thought was shitty hair. Katsuki was sure that any of his teammates would house him, but Kirishima had always been his go-to when SHT got bad. Except, wherever Katsuki went, the paparazzi would follow. If his teammates weren't already fighting away reporters, Katsuki's sudden presence at their home would ensure that they too were swarmed. He could only think of one other option. Katsuki hated that fucking option. It took longer to reach his parents' house than he remembered. Now that Katsuki thought about it, he couldn't remember the last time he'd gone to visit his childhood home. Usually, his parents came to visit him, fed up from not hearing from him for months. Sneaking out of his building had been a beach. He was forced to go to the rooftop and cross several buildings before he deemed it safe enough to make his way down to street level. The train proved easier than expected, as no one seemed to pay him much attention when he took a seat in the corner of one of the cars. Now, walking down familiar streets, Katsuki felt like just another stranger on the sparsely populated side streets. He realized he didn't still have a key to his parents' house when he reached the front door. That oversight was definitely going to cost him in a few seconds when one of his parents answered his loud knocking. As if his day hadn't already gone to SHT, Katsuki's mother answered the door. Mitsuki's welcoming smile quickly changed into a familiar scowl. She crossed her arms after pulling the door in closer to her body, essentially blocking the entryway. Look what the cat dragged in. Katsuki glared at his mother, but he was careful not to make direct eye contact. He tried to step forward, but she further closed the door. I know you're not trying to waltz in here without explanation. I need a place to stay. The pro-hero grunted. Maybe you should have thought of that before you hung up the phone on your mother and never bothered to answer her other calls. Mitsuki. He's under enough stress. Bakugou's mother turned her head to talk to her out-of-sight husband. And we're not. This brat didn't even tell us he was mated, remember? Katsuki took advantage of his mother's distraction to quickly force his way into the house. Hey, watch it. She scolded but didn't stop him from walking past her. Only when Katsuki began climbing the stairs did she try to stop him. Oh no, you don't. Get down here and talk to us. There's nothing to say. Leave me the FCK alone. Like hell, there's nothing to say. We are going to have a long conversation about your actions and why you haven't shared any of them with us. Mitsuki, maybe we should. The younger alpha never heard the rest of his father's words. As soon as he reached his old bedroom, he slammed the door behind him. Katsuki knew how this would go. His mom would rant and rave about how much Katsuki infuriated her. Meanwhile, his father would use some sort of sorcery to calm her down. They'd leave Katsuki alone until, finally, the beta would come in and get Katsuki to talk, or at least to come downstairs and sulk. Until his father arrived to work his magic, Bakugou was alone. He looked around his old bedroom with glazed eyes. It hadn't changed much all these years. Perhaps he should feel lucky that his parents still left it as it had always been. Honestly, he would rather they repurpose the room. Because, as it was, the bedroom was a time capsule of the worst year of his life. Katsuki walked over to his desk and fingered the echoes of words that had been written so roughly onto paper that they carved themselves into the wood below. The characters had overlapped one another from the different writing tasks assigned by his therapist, making them unreadable. He turned to his walls to stare at the pieces of tape still holding up colorful corners of the hero posters Katsuki had torn down when he first heard that Izuku had killed himself. He stared at those pieces for a long time. Eventually, he made his way over to the bed. Instead of sitting, the pro-hero lifted the mattress and grabbed the small metal disc he'd kept hidden there all these years. Katsuki threw the disc slightly into the air, caught it, then tossed it again. He turned to sit on the bed this time before clicking on the device. Shockingly, whatever battery the machine operated off of still worked, despite all these years. This is a projection. The booming voice of All Might in his buff form filled the otherwise silent room. Whoa. You, young Katsuki Bakugo, have impressed all of us here at UA, that's for certain. Not only did you pass the written portion of the entrance exam with flying colors, but you were the top scorer in the practical portion with 72 villain points and 5 rescue points. Of course you've been accepted to UA. Welcome to your Hero Academy. With that, the image flickered before disappearing completely. Katsuki continued to stare at the space where the image had been. Eventually he allowed himself to fall backwards onto the bed and covered his eyes with his right forearm. When he'd received his acceptance, Bakugou had been insanely proud of those 5 rescue points. To him they'd been proof that he wasn't all destructive, he could be heroic too. It felt like all those stupid therapy sessions had helped somehow. Later he found out that all his classmates made more rescue points than him, another challenge to his ego. Hell, if Izuku had attended the entrance exam like he'd once said he would, the quirkless Omega most certainly would have gotten more rescue points than Katsuki, even if he couldn't destroy a single robot without a quirk. But just like that, Katsuki was back to thinking about Izuku. But that's how it had always been. Everything circled back to 2 things, being number 1 and Izuku Midoriya. He'd always thought if he couldn't have one, he'd fight until the end for the other. Now he had neither. The Alpha must have wallowed in his misery for a long time. It was dark by the time he finally removed his arm and opened his eyes at the sound of his door opening. He closed his eyes again and sat up. At least he got one thing right. His father had shown up to talk just as he'd predicted. Brought you food. Katsuki's eyes snapped open to stare at his mother as she set a plate of curry with rice on his desk. Even after she put down the plate, she didn't turn around to face him. I made it extra spicy, just how you like it. The room was quiet until the blonde woman sighed. Bet you were expecting your father. Finally, she turned toward Katsuki but kept her gaze directed as the ceiling. She leaned backwards against the desk, somehow looking both at ease and out of place. Don't ask me why he thought I should be the one to come up here. Masaru was always better at talking. We're the type who yell our feelings, aren't we? Mitsuki smirked as she lowered her eyes to meet Katsuki's, but he turned his head away. Enough of that, brat. Look at me. Katsuki followed her command and their red eyes met for the first time since he'd arrived. His mother's face softened. You gonna tell me why you're here now? Does it have to do with your mate? None of your business. His mother pushed herself off of the desk and Katsuki used the movement as an excuse to avert his gaze to the floor. He listened to her walk over to him and felt the mattress dip under her weight. Both alphas sat quietly as they waited for the other to speak. Finally, Mitsuki broke the silence. Your mate reminds me of Izuku. Katsuki's head snapped up, but he didn't turn to his mother. Why the FCK would you say that? Language. She snapped more out of reflex than anything else, even laughing softly as soon as she'd said it. Her chuckle ended in a sigh. I don't quite know what it is, maybe the smile. Either way, I was staring at the picture they keep plastering on the news of the 2 of you and my first thought was, so he finally found someone to replace Izuku. The words bore into Katsuki's psyche like little parasites making their homes in his skin. His mother didn't realize how both right and wrong her thought was. Is that why you did such a stupid thing, Katsuki? The female alpha eventually continued. Did he remind you of Izuku too, so you put your career and reputation on the line just to make him your mate? That's not how it went. Katsuki muttered under his breath, and his mother sighed again in annoyance this time. Then tell me what really happened, Katsuki. I know your father and mostly I messed up when it came to raising you. Why do you always say, but I know you aren't the type of man to do those things the news said you did. You never saw Omegas as below you, well, no more so than anyone else. There's no way you'd use your status to get what you want. I raised you to fight for what you want, not take it without earning it first. Katsuki muttered again about how that's not what happened, but his mother seemed to ignore him. I know that you never got over it, Izuku's death I mean. Her son tensed beside her, but she kept talking. No matter what we, or the therapists, or anyone else said, I could tell you never stopped blaming yourself. Honestly, I let it slide because it was driving you to be better, to get stronger and control your emotions. Something I never quite mastered. In fact, I felt pretty guilty myself. Inko and I used to be so close, but when Izuku the time of his death, I realized we'd drifted apart. Hell, I don't even know where she is anymore. A sharp pang of guilt struck Katsuki. He hadn't told his mother what he had learned of her old best friend. But now didn't seem to be the time to mention Auntie's death. If I saw her now, I would definitely apologize. That's what you always wanted, right, hun? Mitsuki turned to smile sadly at her son, and Katsuki forced himself to look back at her, visibly swallowing his guilt. You wanted to apologize but never got the chance. Facing her now, Katsuki couldn't hide the raw pain on his face. Katsuki did have the chance to apologize. He'd had the opportunity for so much more than that. For a brief moment, Katsuki had Izuku, and now the only man he'd ever loved was just out of reach, again. Mitsuki leaned over and hugged her son. Katsuki didn't cry, but his body shuddered under the pressure of his guilt. He felt his mother run her hands through his hair in a soothing way. She hadn't done that since he was in preschool. They sat like that until Katsuki fell limp against her strong shoulder. What do I do now? Katsuki eventually whispered. What do you have to do? The younger alpha pulled away and put his head in his hands. I have to resign. It's the only option. The other, those assholes want me to. I can't just share his past with the public like it's my story to tell. All that would do is hurt him. He'd never be seen as anything but a trafficking victim. He wouldn't want the whole country to be looking at him with misplaced pity. How the FCK is he supposed to move on if I drag him through the mud so I can keep my stupid job? Katsuki's felt the sting of a sharp, but soft, whack to the side of his head. Now there's the son I raised. You had me worried there for a bit, I'm not going to lie, but I should have known you would bring honor to the Bakugou name. Mitsuki smiled, her teeth shining in the still dark room. Do what you have to do, Katsuki. Your father and I will support you, especially if you're making the heroic decision. For the first time in days, the tension in Katsuki's shoulders relaxed. He felt lighter, if only by a little. Thanks. We're your parents, Katsuki. Don't forget that. Now, when do we get to meet your mate? What's his name anyway? It doesn't matter, the youngest Bakugou muttered bitterly, ignoring the nagging voice that told him to tell his mother that Izuku was alive and well. He wanted to tell her everything about him and what had happened to the other boy's mother, but, if he did, Mitsuki would never let Izuku go. You'll probably never get the chance to meet him. What? Why in the hell not? With that, Katsuki began to tell his mom all about Itsuki and what had happened between them. Even without including the craziness that was Izuku's true identity, the mother and son spoke long into the night. The vibrations of the door slamming shut shattered Izuku into pieces too small to catch. The condo suddenly felt somehow suffocating and too large at the same time. Izuku felt out of place, like a stranger in someone else's life. Izuku wanted to curl his body into a little, but his feet remained planted in the spot where Kacchan had left him and they refused to move. Maybe he'd come back. Maybe the alpha was blowing off steam in the hallway. Only Katsuki's reaction wasn't his typical anger. Izuku knew from that final pained scowl on his mate's face that the alpha was devastated. He left because he was broken as well. And this too was Izuku's fault. He hadn't meant this to happen. Izuku would never want to hurt his mate, were they still mates, on purpose. The Omega had been frustrated, but more than that, he was tired of pretending. Izuku had never been and would apparently never be the mate Katsuki wanted. Kacchan wanted, deserved, a partner who was whole. One who wasn't haunted by the past at every turn, with little to no warning. Hell, Izuku couldn't even go a week without meeting someone who dredged up horrible memories. Izuku knew too much, had experienced too much to live peacefully. Kacchan had thought Izuku loved him. Izuku didn't know if that concept made him want to laugh or cry. The Omega didn't know what love even meant, let alone whether he felt it for Kacchan. He hoped he would one day, maybe someday, far into the future, Izuku would wake up with the realization, oh, this is love. But now, that wasn't going to happen. For now, Izuku trusted Kacchan. He hadn't trusted anyone in so long, let alone an alpha. But Katsuki wasn't just another alpha. He was Kacchan, the man who swore every few sentences but whose words could soothe the madness that was Izuku's head. He was a pro-hero who defeated villains with explosive fists and shielded vulnerable citizens with his own body. Sure, Kacchan wasn't perfect, but he was good. Good in a way Izuku believed didn't exist anymore. Now he was gone. The rush of emotions that had overwhelmed Izuku suddenly vanished, leaving him emptier than ever before. Suddenly in control of his body again, Izuku didn't bother walking back to the couch. Slowly, he lowered himself to the floor, still in the middle of the hallway, and began to cry. How could he have been so stupid? Forget his own happy ending that he'd royally screwed up. What had he done to Kacchan? Would this new development mean that they could go through with the plan set up by Night Eye? Izuku doubted it. Katsuki hadn't mentioned changing his mind about resigning, only about getting their marriage license revoked. Izuku was used to ruining his own life with his dumb decisions, but ruining Kacchan's. The very thought was a knife in his sisi. Where had Kacchan gone? To his friends or family? On his own? Izuku hoped it was the former. The Omega's head snapped up to look at the condo he'd called home for nearly 2 months. What was Izuku doing here? He didn't belong here. Even with numb limbs, Izuku was able to stand and began walking toward the doors. He had no idea where he was going to go, but he had to get out of here. Izuku had lived on his own before. If he had to, he could take care of himself on the streets again. He made it to the door before he stopped. Where were the keys? Izuku quickly began looking around for the keys and realized with a sinking feeling that Katsuki likely took them with him. A quick inspection of the door didn't reveal any automatic locking function. Meaning, if Izuku left now, he'd have to leave the condo unlocked behind him. It shouldn't have been a big deal, but Izuku couldn't do it. Despite there being no way to lock the door from the outside, Izuku felt trapped. After being forced to stay in places he hated with alphas that caused him nothing but pain, now the Omega felt trapped. All alone and with an unlocked door in front of him. The laugh that echoed through the apartment was borderline hysterical. It took Izuku a second to realize he was the one laughing. When he did, the sound turned into sobs. Now what was he supposed to do? Eventually the tears dried up, but the sensation of hopeless loss remained. Somehow, he had made it to the couch. It occurred to Izuku that he'd been in this same spot waiting for Kacchan only a few days ago. He felt even more alone now. Underneath him, the cushion buzzed. Izuku looked down at where he was sitting and blinked. He forced his hands between the cushion and the armrest until his hand clutched around the smooth sides of a cell phone. Pulling it from the chasm, Izuku realized it was his. How it still had any battery after days without charging, he had no idea. However, it seemed very upset to have been forgotten for so long. Alerts covered the standby screen. After typing in the password, the Messages app opened first. The screen was covered in worried message from Uravity. Alright, they'd exchanged numbers at the end of the party. Izuku had forgotten all about that when he became more preoccupied with Katsuki never coming home. The Omega went to the top, reading messages that became more and more concerned about how he was handling the media scandal as he scrolled down. Eventually he hit the last message. Achiko Uravity, I don't know if you're reading any of these messages, but we're all really worried about you and Bakugou. Please let us know if you need anything. Are you okay? Read 12:27 p.m. Izuku didn't think as his fingers typed out one word on their own. No, with just as little warning, his thumb pressed send. Instantly, Izuku regretted it. He went to type that everything was fine and that he was okay, but the 3 most frightening dots popped up before he could. What's going on? Where are you? Is Bakugou okay? Can I come over? Green eyes widened as the rapid-fire questions popped onto the screen. His phone shook in his hand as his traitorous fingers typed without his consent. At Kacchan's come 10 minutes, Izuku dropped his phone and his hands went immediately to grip his hair. What was he doing? What had he done? He barely knew Uravity. But the message was sent and there was no taking it back. When Uraraka said she'd be there in 10, Izuku assumed she meant it figuratively. Instead, the doorbell rang only 9 minutes later, causing the Omega to nearly jump out of his skin. He scrambled to answer the door, but paused once his hand was on the doorknob. Did he really want to answer it? Maybe he could pretend he wasn't home. This time Uravity knocked. The sound made Izuku automatically open the door. It's Suki. Uraraka's arms twitched at her sides as if they wanted to reach out, but she held them firmly against her legs. What's wrong? Izuku stared at the woman standing in his doorway. He remembered her sitting next to him on a hotel bed asking him questions. He thought of the look of shock on her face after he'd kissed Kacchan in front of the group. Then he remembered her apology and offer of friendship. Without thinking about it, Izuku reached out and hugged her. Immediately, the pro-hero returned the gesture, her surprisingly muscular arms wrapping around his back. As soon as they parted and closed the door behind them, the words came gushing out. It was shocking how effortless it felt to explain what had happened with Kacchan, even with leaving out several crucial details, and by crucial details, Izuku meant his identity, he and Kacchan's past, what happened with Shoto, and just about every other detail of Izuku's life. Izuku found the story falling from his lips without fear. He explained how he and Kacchan became mates and how Izuku came to trust him enough to want to be mates for real. He went on to talk about the media scandal and how the mates' visit to Plus Ultra turned out to be a disaster. Finally, Izuku explained their final fight. He's gone, Uraraka. He's gone and I don't know that he's coming back. I don't want to be alone. Not again. Achiko gripped the hand she was holding tightly, leaning into his shoulder in a comforting fashion. You're not alone, Itsuki. And, while I'm pissed that Bakugou left you here, it sounds like you both need to talk about this more. I can hear it in your voice. You really care about him. Don't give up. Izuku stared at his lap intently. But what if he doesn't want to talk anymore? He said we wouldn't see each other again. Then we'll get a group together to find him and drag him back here by force. Achiko chirped with a scarily cheery smile. Izuku squeaked in surprise, pulling his hand free so that he could wave his hands back and forth in front of his face. You don't have to do that. Well then, that idiot better get with the program. Don't say that. Uraraka started to laugh and Izuku swore her bright deposition was infectious. For the first time in the last 24 hours, the Omega felt like he could finally breathe. Izuku gave his new friend a weak smile. Sorry for calling you over so suddenly. Are you kidding? I've been dying to come over since the news dropped, but Tenya wouldn't let me. The pink hero's cheeks puffed out in a pout. He said it was rude to come uninvited. Still, Izuku insisted. I really appreciate it. I know we haven't known each other very long and I'm already putting a lot of my problems on you. You're doing no such thing. Friends are here for the good and the bad. Speaking of which, Uraraka began to look around the table and couch. Does Bakugou have cable? My favorite drama is going to start in like half an hour. You want to watch it together? The beta held the cherished remote above her head when she finally dug it out between the couch cushions, completely missing the way green eyes widened at her invitation. The Omega had assumed that Uraraka would leave as soon as she possibly could. He hadn't really hung out with someone besides Kacchan, unless you counted Himiko and Izuku didn't anymore. But when the pro-hero turned to him with her brilliant smile, how was Izuku supposed to say no? I'm sure. But I don't know what's going on. A strange glint appeared in the brunette's eyes. Oh no. What did Izuku just get himself into? Uraraka embarked on a rant that lasted nearly as long as Izuku's earlier explanation of his situation. Scratch that, it was definitely longer. As the girl began to introduce character upon character, each with their own motivations and shocking plot twists, Izuku found himself getting more and more lost. Uraraka didn't seem to mind when the Omega stopped her mid-sentence to get reminders of who was who or to reiterate an earlier plot point. In fact, she got more and more excited as Izuku slowly caught on. Unfortunately, they didn't get to finish their drama cram session before the new episode aired, but Izuku knew enough by now to gasp at the right moments and scream when the evil twin pulled out a gun on the romantic interest. By the time the episode ended, they were both groaning at the to-be-continued screen. How could it end there? Izuku whined. Oh, if you like the show, you have to watch this one. Uraraka grinned evilly as she already went about logging into some streaming service. 3 episodes in, Uraraka's phone buzzed. She picked it up, her fingers tapping on the screen while her eyes were still glued to the television. Hey, do you mind company? Izuku visibly startled at the question, but Uraraka didn't seem to notice. The man bit his lip. Would Kacchan be angry if he invited people over to his house? Then again, Kacchan wasn't here now, was he? I guess that's fine. Cool, they're on their way. Who's they? Uraraka didn't respond as she laughed at the on-screen antics. Izuku was going to ask again, but then he too was distracted by the sudden change in music signaling that something dramatic was about to occur. Honestly, Izuku didn't remember that other people were coming until he heard the doorbell ring. Izuku quickly jumped to his feet to answer the door and was surprised to see Tsuyu and Habuko. Sorry it took us a bit. Those reporters are strong to dodge, ribbit. Uraraka called from the living room as Izuku moved so that his guests could enter. I warned ya. It was another 5 episodes in when the doorbell rang again. This time Uraraka jumped up to get the door and Izuku didn't mind considering that his eyes were glued to the dramatic scene unfolding in the show. Apologies for my tardiness. There was much to be done in the office today, but thank you very much for inviting me to the festivities. Izuku looked up and smiled toward the still too formal Ida. Thanks for coming. Quiet you guys. Habuko hissed. I can't hear. Ida and Uraraka quickly made their way into the living room properly, Uraraka leaning over to Izuku to whisper in his ear. Shinso said to say he'll come by next time. He has a night shift. Izuku nodded and smiled understandingly. The thought of there being next time caused a warm sensation to fill his ear. At some point, Uraraka flipped herself over the edge of the couch so that she was hanging upside down. I'm hungry. We could order pizza, ribbit. The color drained from Izuku's face. He didn't have any money for takeout. But Ida had someone procured a pen and a pad of paper and was demanding that they coordinate toppings. Pineapple like always, darling. We enjoy sesardines. What about you, Izuku? Uraraka turned her upside head to her left to Izuku. I'm fine. Nonsense. Ida chopped the air with his hand. We insist you get something you enjoy and that you allow us to pay for it, seeing as you were kind enough to invite us over. Yeah. Most certainly. Uraraka and Tsu chimed in while Habuko nodded her head. Izuku started to fumble with the sleeve of his long-sleeved shirt. You might like green peppers. Wonderful. Then we can split a large, half peppers, half mushrooms. 1 large sardines, and 1 medium pineapple. Ida rattled off the order, already typing in the phone number. When the pizza finally arrived, Izuku couldn't believe that he had argued against getting the delicious circles of carbs covered in melted cheese, sauce, and scrumptious toppings. Izuku couldn't remember the last time he'd had such slices of heaven. Needless to say, he was only kind of embarrassed when he ate all the green pepper slices and the leftover pineapple ones too. It was pitch black outside by the time they somehow had watched the whole first season of the drama. At that point, the group realized they should call it a night. As Izuku thanked his guests on their way out, a thought occurred to him. Uraraka. The beta stopped halfway through the doorway and turned to look at her friend. Do you have Shoto's number? Izuku walked up to the massive traditional Japanese home and instantly felt small. He hesitated at the metal gate as he checked his phone for the time. Even after taking 2 buses and a train as well as spending half an hour dilly-dallying in the condo, worrying about the consequences of leaving it unlocked in order to depart on this adventure, Izuku somehow managed to arrive 20 minutes early. He could ring the bell now, but he was too early. Awkwardly early. He could stand around, but that would be even more awkward. The only logical thing would be to walk back down to the bus stop, wait there for 15 minutes, and then come back. Izuku jumped at the high-pitched welcome. Green eyes darted back and forth before looking down at the little boy standing on the other side of the gate. Hello. It had been a while since Izuku had interacted with a child, especially one so small. Izuku wasn't tall, but it looked like the kid wouldn't reach his waist. The boy had shorter black hair that framed his face, careful not to cover his shining blue eyes. He was dressed in a striped collared shirt and freshly pressed shorts. Are you here to visit Mama or Daddy? The boy looked Izuku up and down, before nodding with conviction. Daddy. Izuku blinked in confusion then in surprise. You must be Shoto's son. I'm Soichi. Pleased sure to meet you. The boy politely bowed, completely unaware of how he mispronounced pleasure. You coming in? I guess. Let me just. Izuku started to walk over to the intercom. That's okay. The boy held out his left arm between the bars before bringing up his right hand. Without warning, fire surrounded the tiny hand, hooking the skin of the opposite forearm. Izuku yelped, quickly jumping to stop the child from hurting himself but stopped last second. The fiery hand began to pull a sturdy metal key out of his arm. Once complete, the fire died away and the boy held the key out. Here you go. Eyes wide and mouth agape, Izuku grabbed the key. Wow, that's amazing. The small child beamed as Izuku stuck the key into the lock. It turned with ease and the gate slowly opened. Thanks, Mr. It's Itsuki. Okay, Itsuki-san. Izuku's eye twitched at the honorific. My quirk is really cool. Mama calls it smalting. Do you mean smelting? Yeah. That. 'Cause I use fire to make just about anything. If I know how. Like Mama. Only I don't get hungry and cranky if I use it too much. Wow. Izuku smiled down at the child who now turned and started walking toward the house. The older man quickly fell in step. So it's like a mix of your mother's and father's quirk. Soichi frowned in confusion. No, it's just like Mama's quirk. Daddy uses ice, not fire. Izuku frowned as well, biting his lower lip. Shoto never used his fire. It shouldn't be a surprise then that he never told his children about his other half. Sorry, my mistake. Izuku went quiet for a second as they walked. How did you know I was here to see your father? You have a scar like Daddy. Izuku almost tripped but caught himself last second. Well, the kid wasn't wrong, flawed logic as it was. The little boy was all smiles again as they continued to walk toward the front door. Once they entered the home and kicked off their shoes, it didn't surprise Izuku to see that the inside was also very traditionally decorated. Expensive-looking pieces of art dotted the walls as they walked down a large hallway until they entered what looked like a formal sitting room. On one of the cushions, with his back toward the entrance, Izuku easily recognized Shoto's two-toned hair. In front of him was a small toddler with gray eyes and pure white hair with one chubby hand outstretched in front of her and the other stuffed in her mouth. Izuku watched as Shoto created tiny ice crystals in his daughter's hand, which she promptly stuffed in her mouth while holding out her other hand for more. The smile on Shoto's face made Izuku want to walk right back out the front door. Daddy. Soichi darted over to his dad, barely stopping himself from bumping into him at the last second. The boy gave a quick small bow. We have a guest. Shoto's eyes darted upward to Izuku and he stood immediately. Itsuki, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you'd already arrived. Izuku quickly shook his head. No, I'm sorry for intruding so early. Below them, the men heard the beginnings of a whimper. They both turned to see the little toddler with both arms outstretched toward her father, tears building in her eyes. Shoto quickly reached down to pick her up, rubbing her back soothingly before turning to Soichi. Can you take your sister to your mother? Soichi nodded too enthusiastically as he held out his arms. Izuku was shocked that he could hold the toddler, considering the little girl was practically half his height. Once the little boy half carried, half waddled his way out of the room, the elder Todoroki motioned toward one of the cushions on the other side of the low table. Izuku nodded politely and sat crossed-legged in the seat across from where the pro-hero had been sitting just moments ago. Would you like any tea or another beverage? No, I don't hope to take up much of your time. Shoto nodded tersely before lowering himself to sit on his legs. The room fell into a tense silence. I read your complaint. Izuku finally spoke first. The number 4 hero didn't react. Do you have any idea what you've done? I'm sorry. It was not my intention for it to be released publicly. I merely, doesn't matter if that was your intention or not. Why did you think you had the right to meddle in mine and Kacchan's lives? Shoto's blue eye winced slightly. Itsuki, please, Izuku held up a hand. Just let me say this. I don't blame you for what happened. Not really. But I had to say something. It wasn't my intention to tell you all those things at the party. I would have been happier never talking about what happened with my first mate. Booty needed to say what I said. You needed to hear it. You're not your father. Izuku ignored how Shoto tensed. And you never will be. I mean, look at you and your daughter. That was downright cute. I've been hiding for years. I've had to lie for nearly half my life about who I really was. Seeing you deny half yourself, it's the same thing, Shoto. Your son doesn't even know that he's inherited part of his quirk from you. I can't tell you how happy I've been now that I can finally be honest with someone, with myself. But even now I am paying for the things I didn't say when I still had the chance to be honest. I came here to tell you, no, I don't blame you for what happened. But if you really want to help me, as your complaint suggested, then be honest about yourself. Accept yourself. Let yourself be happy because I was. Izuku began to stand. Why didn't you ever go to the police? Izuku paused, legs still bent and hands still on the ground. After you left my father, why not just report him? The men stared at each other until Izuku sighed. At first I was scared like you. Endeavor may have been retired, but he was still a powerful man. I didn't trust the police very much, and it was the voice of a no-name Omega against the past #2 pro hero. What he did was wrong, Shoto snarled. Who wouldn't believe you? Which part, Shoto? Izuku laughed humorlessly. I think in terms of bruises and burn marks, we were about the same. Or are you talking about us being mated? Because, guess what, it wasn't illegal. To everyone who mattered, I was 19 and it was totally, or should I say, my family's right to sell myself to a suitable mate. In case you haven't noticed, the government isn't looking to protect people in my situation. All anyone cares about nowadays is mates and babies. This time, Izuku stood for real. Green eyes stared down into mismatched ones. Do you know what would happen if I tried to? Report him now. My mating to Katsuki would become null and void. Because, technically, we are still married. So instead of asking me why I don't do it, ask yourself why you still haven't. Shoto started to stand, but Izuku was already leaving the room. The Omega was only a little surprised that the Alpha didn't follow. Izuku was putting on his shoes at the front door when he heard a voice behind him. I ordered you a car. Izuku looked up to see Momo rocking yet another child in her arms, then turned back to his shoes. I'm fine. I don't need to drag more attention to myself. As Izuku stood, he expected the other Omega to comment further, but he was surprised by what she said. I wanted to thank you. The male Omega turned, startled by the thanks. For what? For what you said to Shoto. Momo turned her head down the hallway toward the room where her mate likely still was. Shoto and I have been engaged since the middle of our second year. At the time, it was mainly logistics. 2 recommendation students from well-off families, it made the most sense. As you know, an Omega like myself can't become a pro hero without a mate after all. The baby in her arms cooed and Momo rearranged the blanket to reveal the dark fuzz of hair on the baby's head. But before I knew it, I fell for Shoto. I don't know when he started to feel the same way, but eventually it became obvious to me that something was wrong. Everyone from Class A knows Shoto hates his father, but I didn't find out why until I was PRGNT with our first child. No matter how many times I've told him that he's a wonderful mate and a wonderful father, I see the doubt behind his eyes. I'll never forget the pain on Shoto's face when Soichi's quirk came in. Momo looked up from her child to meet Izuku's wary eyes. After the party, Shoto was distraught, but he was also different. I've never felt the vulnerability, the openness he shared with me that night. I'm sorry we've caused you so much trouble. Shoto refused to let me put my name on the complaint as well in case there was any retaliation from Plus Ultra or the Hero Association for reporting one of our own. But we needed to do something. We did our best to leave it as open-ended as possible, while still making sure you were being treated with the respect you deserve. This supposed scandal is preposterous. Izuku finally turned away and continued toward the front door. No, what's preposterous is that you needed to file a formal complaint to make sure a Hero Association wasn't taking advantage of an Omega in their care. Izuku muttered under his breath as he walked out the door, closing it despite Momo opening her mouth to comment. The trip back to the condo took twice as long as it did to get to Shoto's mini mansion. Well, no, it didn't, but it sure felt like it did. Izuku didn't have to work too strong to avoid the slightly smaller crowd of reporters still standing in front of the building. No one seemed to spare the small man in plain jeans and a hoodie a second glance. They only cared about Ground Zero and any other pro-heroes who could comment on the scandal. Unless Izuku was about to give them some juicy information on his mate. Which was never going to happen. Talking with Shoto had been just as emotionally taxing as it had been the first time. Izuku now wanted to crawl into bed and hide under a blanket for a few hours. When the elevator doors opened to Izuku's floor, green eyes instantly met red ones. Izuku stared into the eyes of his mate long enough that the elevator doors began to slide shut. The Omega had to stretch out his arm to activate the safety mechanism to force them open again to exit the elevator. Katsuki pushed himself to his feet from where he was sitting next to his front door before Izuku could close the space between them. "What are you doing out here, Kacchan?" Izuku asked, his voice artificially stoic as he slowly walked down the hallway. Katsuki scoffed but didn't break eye contact. "You weren't answering the door. But it's your condo. I'm not gonna scare the SHT out of you by sitting on the couch when you got back." Finally, in front of Katsuki, Izuku stopped. They held each other's gaze a second longer before Katsuki angled his body toward the door. "We gonna just stand out here all day?" "Go ahead, it's not locked." "What the FCK?" Katsuki muttered under his breath, his eyebrow twitching slightly in annoyance. "Why would you leave it unlocked?" "Didn't have a choice." Izuku raised his own eyebrow questioningly so that his voice didn't have to. "You took the keys with you." The Alpha didn't respond to that. He also didn't move to open the door. Not waiting any longer, Izuku went ahead and turned the knob to enter the condo himself. He could feel Katsuki following closely behind him, and Izuku did his best to keep his back straight and eyes forward. He knew full well that the second Izuku relaxed, he'd fall back under Kacchan's spell. There was too much to address before he allowed himself such luxury. But DMN. That thick scent of smoke radiating off his, once mate threatened to anesthetize him, weakening Izuku's will to fight a little more with each breath. Even inside the condo and several feet apart, Izuku still didn't turn to look at Katsuki. He wanted to, oh how he needed to, but he didn't. "I thought you weren't coming back." Izuku whispered to the photo of Ground Zero and his hero team. A shadow passed in the reflection of the glass as Katsuki neared but kept his distance. "Didn't plan to." Like a belt whipped across his back, the words physically stung. Then why was Kacchan here? Did the other man come back to yell some more? Did he bring the papers to void their mating? Though, if the papers hadn't required Izuku's signature to agree to the mating, the Omega doubted they required his consent to end it either. Behind him, Bakugou growled. In anger or frustration, Izuku couldn't pinpoint which. "Would you turn the FCK around?" Izuku didn't, and he heard the legs of the coffee table SC across the floor as Kacchan likely kicked it away from him. "Fine, then don't. I'll say what I came to say and leave." "Got it." The pause the pro-hero gave for Izuku to answer wasn't long enough to reply, even if Izuku had wanted to. "I warned you before that I wasn't good at this shittleking apologizing." Izuku finally turned at that, his body moving on its own, his eyes the size of small planets. Katsuki held his gaze with fierce determination. "Instead, I'll start with what I'm good at." "You're fking wrong, Deku." Again, that nickname sliding off the Alpha's tongue caused shivers to run down Izuku's spine. "I know I love you, and I mean you goddamn, but there's no way in hell I'd say something so weak if it wasn't the truth. And it doesn't fking matter if you don't love me or not. What matters is what you want, what you really want. If you want to be mates, then I'll be the best mate this world has fking seen. If you want safety, support, I'll be an explosive wall between you and the world. If you want to start fresh," Izuku didn't miss the slight twitch of Katsuki's hands. "If you want to start over, on your own, then I'll step out of your way for good this time. But before you tell me what the hell you want, I have to say this. Ever since I heard you were gone, I realized I was wrong. What I said, what I did to you was unforgivable. I hated everything, myself especially, because..." Katsuki swore to himself as his body began to shake. Instinctively, Izuku took a step forward, but a stiff arm shot upward in between them as Bakugou signaled for him to stop. "Because it was my fault you were gone, and no one could ever convince me otherwise. I know now that you didn't kill yourself, but if you had, it would have been on me." "Kacchan, Izuku slumped as the heavy weight of guilt fell on his shoulders. That's not true. Like hell it isn't. The alpha growled before finally averting his eyes. I thought about it non-stop. I had years and years to replay what happened between us. All this time, all I wanted to do was to make up for it, to fix that SHT and finally do something right. And I thought, Katsuki's voice cut off in a strangled sound between a yell of frustration and a sob. I thought I'd never be able to do that because you were dead. But here you are, you've been right here and I haven't done any to make up for all those years I tortured you. All I've done is let bad happen to you. Like, Katsuki waved his hands angrily through the air. Whatever the hell this situation is now. You think I'm resigning because I'm giving up. Are you fucking stupid? After everything that's happened to you, after I finally earn your trust, do you really think I could just let those bastards at my agency use you as a scapegoat? How could I just tell your story as if it was mine to tell? FCK that and FCK them. Izuku stared at the pro-hero with newfound understanding as the anxious thoughts suddenly aligned with a frightening realization. Kacchan wasn't throwing away his career just so they could stay mates. Kacchan wasn't resigning for some misplaced CNCPTN of what their relationship was. He was resigning for Izuku's sake and Izuku's alone. Katsuki not only realized what telling the world about Izuku's past would mean for the Omega, a reality that Izuku hadn't even entertained in his own consuming need to protect Kacchan's reputation, but was also willing to sacrifice his own career to protect Izuku's privacy. Suddenly, Izuku felt himself begin to shake as tears stung at his eyes. Red eyes met green before darting off to the side again. Was that the wrong thing to say? I told you I wasn't any good. Izuku threw restraint to the wind as he wrapped his arms around Katsuki. The other man flinched in surprise at the contact, his arms coming upwards as if to push Izuku off before they fell lower to slide around the smaller man's back. Muscular arms tightened around Izuku, pressing him into his alpha's ST, but Izuku didn't feel trapped in the slightest. Rather, Izuku didn't know what he felt. Relief, fear, gratitude, anger, hopelessness. Izuku didn't bother apologizing for the tears soaking Kacchan's shirt. Instead, Izuku voiced the single thought that permeated the mess of emotions coming over him. What do we do now, Kacchan? If the sudden question startled Katsuki, the pro-hero didn't show it. His arms tightened across Izuku's back and his sharp chin rested on top of the shorter man's head. I told you, whatever the hell you want. Izuku sucked in a shaky breath. What did he want? I want to get out of here. Katsuki leaned backward, separating Izuku's face from his now damp shirt, but his fingers still pressed lightly against the Omega's back. His face looked calm, a practiced composure that couldn't quite hide the anxiety in the Alpha's eyes. What do you mean by that? Izuku gripped his own arms tighter, squeezing Katsuki in the process. I just want to go somewhere. With you. Alone. Far away from here. Izuku stared into Kacchan's eyes for a bit before the man nodded sharply. The arms around his waist fell away and Izuku released his hold in turn. Katsuki walked purposefully toward the hall closet, opening it and grabbing a worn cloth backpack that he then threw to Izuku without warning. By some miracle, Izuku caught it by one of the straps, nearly falling down face first due to having to step forward on unsteady legs to do so. Grab some food. Izuku blinked at his mate with wide doe eyes. What? Unfortunately, Katsuki had already disappeared down the hallway toward the bedrooms. Panicking, Izuku all but ran into the kitchen, setting the bag on the counter as he began to open cabinets. What the hell was happening? What kind of food was he supposed to pack? And how much? Where were they going? Did Kacchan misunderstand him and think that Izuku meant they should go on the run? That last thought caused Izuku an immense amount of anxiety, but that didn't keep him from his assigned task. It did, however, cause him to pack a variety of foodstuffs ranging from canned goods and cups of ramen to granola and trail mix. The bag he'd been given wasn't especially large, but by the time Izuku was finished with it, it was fairly hefty. Finally exiting the kitchen, Izuku saw that Kacchan was waiting for him, his outfit slightly modified after switching out his damp t-shirt for a thin long-sleeved shirt and vest. He also had a backpack now, along with a beanie and sunglasses, standard anti-paparazzi gear. Okay, that thought of them going on the run didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. You got enough stuff there, nerd? Izuku's cheeks were dusted with the slightest hint of pink as Katsuki made his way over to the door. "It's not heavy." Izuku mumbled his half-lie. It wasn't too heavy for him to carry, but it definitely wasn't light. At the door, Kacchan waited for the Omega to reach his side. The Alpha held out his hand and Izuku's heart began to race. Did he want to hold hands? In front of all those reporters? But when their hands overlapped, Izuku felt a small bit of metal pressed into his skin. Katsuki pulled back his hand and Izuku stared down at the key in his palm. "I'll go out first, get those assholes' attention. Meet me at the rail station. You know where that is, right?" Izuku nodded, closing his fist around the key. "Lock up this time." "I told you," Izuku groaned. "I didn't have a choice last time." The Alpha just smirked, already halfway toward the elevator. Izuku waited until the metal doors shut on his mate before he allowed himself to smile too. And then he locked the door. Were they actually running away for good? Was this it? They'd already switched between 3 different rail lines and Izuku had no idea where the hell they were headed. It was late afternoon now and they were supposed to meet for Katsuki's public statement in less than 24 hours. Taking into account how long it would take them to get back, they really didn't have a lot of time to dawdle. Well, if they really were making a break for it, guess it didn't matter if they stayed out late tonight. Oi! Izuku fell sideways from the sharp elbow connecting with his ribs. "Snap out of it. We're here." "Where's here?" The Omega turned to his Alpha as the other stood. "You said you wanted to get away." Izuku stood as well, his face likely showing his anxiety. "I didn't say I wanted to run away, as in forever." Katsuki turned sharply to face Izuku, a scowl on his face. "What? Why the hell would we do that?" I mean, we're not." Thankfully, the train came to a stop and Izuku was able to rush off the train car rather than explain his anxieties further. Of course, once on the track Izuku had no idea in which direction they were headed. Kacchan was right behind him, however, and took the lead without hesitation. They were far away from downtown now, that much was for sure. Walking outside of the small station, the pair was surrounded by woods. Katsuki crossed the dirt road, headed straight for a forest path on the other side. Izuku stopped in his tracks in the middle of the road with sudden realization. "Are we going on a hike?" The Alpha didn't stop, but did turn his head over his shoulder to scowl. "Is that a problem?" Izuku shook his head as he jogged to catch up to Katsuki. "No, it's not. Kacchan likes to hike, if I'm remembering correctly." Katsuki grunted and Izuku thought that was the only response he was going to get. "But then it helps clear my head. It's where I come to get away." The admission both surprised and soothed Izuku. So when Izuku said he wanted to go away, it reminded Katsuki of what he would do to relax. Easily, the mates fell into a delicate silence. Despite the great weather, they only passed a couple of other people on the trail Kacchan had chosen for them. The only sounds Izuku heard were the crunch of their footsteps on loose rocks and the imperfect symphony of buzzing insects. Hiking wouldn't have been Izuku's first choice of leisure activity, that's for sure. He didn't mind being outside, and he enjoyed physical activity, but the tranquil nature of a casual stroll through the trees went against his hyperactive brain. He was used to the city, used to always having to have his wits about him in case anyone tried to pull a fast one on him. Yet, that was kind of the point, wasn't it? This was supposed to be relaxing, a chance to forget about the rest of society and how shitty it could be. Still, Izuku was kind of glad that Kacchan hiked the way he did everything else. Efficiently, purposefully, as if in charge of even this calm situation. It was a familiar sensation with the pro hero and it was a comforting one, too. They'd been walking for over an hour when Izuku noticed that Katsuki had significantly increased their pace. As Izuku struggled to keep up, it occurred to Izuku that maybe they were actually going somewhere in particular and not just walking. Before he could ask about it, the pro hero turned off the trail. Walking off the beaten path was way harder than Izuku would have guessed. The mates walked through the trees a lot more slowly, hardly covering any ground. Which was Izuku's fault. It was a huge struggle to dodge tree limbs and roots anywhere near as gracefully as Kacchan made it look. Izuku took back all those thoughts about hiking being relaxing. He'd never been so focused on his surroundings in his life. Hurry up already. Katsuki called from ahead, his voice lacking any real annoyance. I'm coming. I'm coming. Izuku speed up to disastrous consequences. His right foot hit a raised root and down he went. Flailing hands did little to stabilize him, grasping at nothing but air. As the Omega braced himself to hit the forest floor, a strong hand on his elbow caught him at a tilt. Careful. Kacchan barked, pushing Izuku up by the arm before grabbing the other man by the hood of his sweatshirt to stabilize him. You're lucky we're almost there. Again, Izuku was going to question where exactly there was supposed to be, but his ability to think straight disappeared the second Katsuki intertwined the fingers of his right hand in Izuku's left. The tug of his arm got Izuku walking again, but he was far more focused on the sensation of warmth in his hand. He'd missed this the last few days, the contact, the closeness it symbolized. Izuku had never wanted to be so close to someone in this way. It wasn't familial. It wasn't friendship. And even though he enjoyed sleeping with Kacchan, this current feeling wasn't sexual. In fact, Izuku didn't know how to describe this longing. But right now, walking hand in hand in a straight line through dense forest satisfied that indescribable need, filling his whole body with calm. What did it matter where they were going? Izuku just wanted to go there with Kacchan. After tens of minutes spent trudging through the forest, the pair ducked under a tree branch and Izuku knew they'd made it to their destination. On either side of them there were still the tall looming trees, but directly in front of them, the forest had ended in a drop-off forming a small cliff. Wow, Izuku whispered breathlessly. They weren't high, but the view was still spectacular. Somehow, they'd made it before the sun finished setting. Izuku stood at the very edge watching bright yellow fade into hushed oranges and full reds as a heavy curtain of impenetrable navy closed in on the sun. The Omega was so transfixed by the appealing sight that he nearly jumped when he felt a hand pulling on his wrist from below. He turned and saw that Kacchan had laid out a tarp and sat down. Izuku took a seat beside him, shaking off his backpack and leaning his head against the hero's shoulder as he watched the last minutes of the day disappear before their eyes. When it was gone, Izuku let out a contented sigh before stretching out his arms and legs in all directions. He let himself fall backwards, careful to catch his head in his arms. Kacchan didn't follow his lead, but did lay his hand out to his side, palm up. Izuku removed one of his arms from behind his head and intertwined their fingers again. They sat like that for a while, Izuku staring up at the stars and Katsuki staring out over the cliff's edge. You hungry? The Omega shook his head, despite not having eaten all day. He was happy just lying down, resting for the first time in what felt like days. From the corner of his eye, he could see Katsuki grab Izuku's backpack with his free hand. Izuku kept his eyes fixed on the stars as he heard his mate rummaging through all the stuff he'd brought. What the FCK? Katsuki muttered under his breath as he pulled out a can of mixed fruit, setting it on the tarp next to a bag of uncooked rice and a whole carrot. What is all this SHT? You didn't say how much to bring. Katsuki shook his head in disbelief as he grabbed a granola bar and tore open the plastic wrapper with his teeth. Izuku listened to the quiet chewing of his mate and drew the few constellations he remembered his mom teaching him during his childhood with a free finger. Can we stay like this forever, Kacchan? Izuku whispered to the sky, his hands stilling in the air before dropping to his side. The Alpha paused before shoving what little remained of his makeshift dinner in his mouth. Is that what you want, Deku? He asked, finally finished chewing. Izuku didn't respond. But that's what Kacchan was waiting for. He wanted Izuku to decide. What did Izuku want? Kacchan. He wanted Kacchan to be happy. He wanted to wake up next to his Alpha, run his hand through blonde spiky hair until crimson eyes opened and officially started his day. He wanted to beat Kacchan back from work and surprise him with a dinner that Izuku somehow didn't ruin. He wanted to start a family, no kids, not now, maybe never, but maybe a cat or a dog or a rabbit. Whatever Kacchan wanted, just something fluffy that they had to feed and care for, together. Together. That was the most important part. I want us to be together, Kacchan. Slowly, Katsuki stretched his legs out in front of him and lowered himself to lie next to Izuku. He also stared up at the sky, but their hands stayed woven together. Then I'll make sure that happens. Izuku frowned, knowing exactly what he meant by that. You shouldn't have to resign. You're an amazing hero, the world needs you. Then we'll go somewhere else. Move to America or somewhere that's not stupid enough to fire the soon-to-be #1 hero, and I'll apply for a new license there. And lose everything you've worked for here. You'd be starting from scratch. Think I can't do it? Kacchan. It's fing fine, Deku. Katsuki's voice quieted. Even if I had to stop being a hero for good, it is what it is. I would rather do the right thing. And lose than win, at our expense. What about your family? What about your friends? The pro-hero didn't respond, but he squeezed his mate's hand. Izuku got the message. It'd be strong for the alpha, harder than he would ever admit, but Kacchan was serious about this. He was willing to do whatever it took to make Izuku happy. Again they fell into silence. The old hag likes you already. Izuku turned his head to face Katsuki in surprise. Katsuki didn't do the same but smirked in acknowledgement before clarifying. Well, she likes Itsuki. Is that where you went? When you were gone? Katsuki grunted affirmatively. Izuku turned his head back to look at the sky, a deeply unsettling feeling sitting on his ear. He knew what he was about to do. I went to visit Shoto today. It would have been impossible to miss the way the alpha tensed his whole body in response, especially with their hands still holding one another. But the other man asked through gritted teeth. Izuku paused, not in hesitation, but rather in preparation. Then he told him. Everything. About the party, about wanting to thank the other alpha for something the other hero didn't know he was responsible for. The Omega spoke of their second meeting and even about speaking with Creati. But, most importantly, Izuku told his partner about his first mate. It was a good thing that no one else was around, or the smell of fire would have prompted a huge panic. But besides the overwhelming scent Katsuki released without meaning to, the alpha didn't interrupt, and most shockingly, his hand never so much as heated up in Izuku's. I'll kill him. Katsuki spoke with such certainty when Izuku finally finished that the Omega immediately began to panic. Kacchan, this is why I didn't say anything before. That fucker deserves to die after what he did to you, and I guess what he did to the rest of his family too. It doesn't matter, the hell it doesn't. Look, it happened, it shouldn't have. I'll kill your father too. Izuku Siga, they weren't getting anywhere. You're right, it shouldn't have happened. A person shouldn't be able to be mated off without even requiring their signature, and people shouldn't crucify the person in the wrong while ignoring the system that is allowing it to happen to someone else at this very moment. Katsuki didn't respond to that, knowing full well they weren't just talking about Izuku's first mate anymore. If you really want to know, that's what I want. That's what I actually want. Suddenly, Izuku sat up, an epiphany hitting him with such force that it nearly took his breath away. That's what I want. Izuku whispered in wonder, before turning to face Katsuki, who had sat up himself. What time is it? I don't fing know. After 9. Give me your phone. Izuku was exhausted. How the hell did he stay up all those nights working before? Staring at himself in the bathroom mirror, several hairs stuck to his forehead and still dripping with the water he'd splashed on his face to wake himself up, he could see the effects of last night's all-nighter. But aside from his raccoon eyes and pale face, he looked decent enough. He felt self-conscious about the long-sleeve shirt with it being such a hot day outside, but it was better than everyone staring at his scars. He'd considered covering the scar on his cheek with makeup but decided against it last second. Last chance to back out Deku. Green eyes darted sideways in the mirror to meet the reflection of his mate leaned against one of the bathroom stalls behind Izuku. The alpha looked tense, his muscles flexed, arms crossed against his knee. The Omega looked back at his own reflection, taking it in as he took in a breath. Let's go. It was easy to be confident alone with his mate in the bathroom, not so effortless when they re-entered the harsh reality of their situation. Katsuki half-led Izuku through the crowd in the lobby of Plus Ultra Hero Agency with a hand on the small of his back. Izuku appreciated the aid, mainly because he found it impossible to concentrate on his destination with the chaos around them. He could hear the protesters outside, their angry chants for Kacchan's resignation muffled by the thick glass walls of the building but clear whenever someone entered via the main doors. To Izuku's right, the lines for security shrunk by the second as media showed their passes and pro-heroes flashed their licenses to gain entry. No civilians were allowed in the press conference room, a fact that angered Izuku on principle but one he couldn't help but feel glad about now. To his left and in the direction they were headed, the crowd shuffled into the packed press room to take their spots standing along the walls. The chairs had long ago been taken. As they passed, several people glanced their way. It was strong to miss Katsuki dressed in his hero costume. Still, no one was dumb enough to call out to him or block their way, lest they be removed by the heroes hovering around the lobby acting as security guards for the day. The mates overshot the front doors, taking one of the side hallways toward the rear entrance. It was obvious that they were in the right place when they noticed Sir Night-Eye, Lemillion, Kirishima, and Mina all standing around the corner, all dressed in their respective hero attire. The groups merged practically seamlessly. Practically, because Izuku didn't miss the subtle questioning glance Sir Night-Eye sent the pair. It went unsaid that he was surprised by Izuku's presence here, with the group about to take the stage, rather than sitting in the chair reserved for him next to Sun Eater in the crowd. You requested seats for your teammates but failed to mention Itsuki joining us on stage. Sir Night-Eye directed his statement to Ground Zero, but his eyes never left Izuku's face. Slipped my mind. Sir Night-Eye hummed skeptically. Have you made your decision? I made mine a long time ago. Katsuki responded coolly, still somehow in control of the situation despite what he was about to say to the crowd. Very well then, let us begin. The head of Plus Ultra turned to the door, Lemillion following in step behind him with his signature smile. Red Riot gave his friends 2 thumbs up while Mina pushed him forward with a wink in Izuku's direction. Izuku's breath caught in his throat at the gesture. Was he making a mistake? There was no going back after this. What if he messed it all up? What if he only made things worse for Kacchan? A hand around his wrist brought Izuku's vision back into focus. He turned to face Katsuki and was shocked by the quick, rough embrace against his lips. I can hear your thoughts from here, idiot. No matter what, we'll win, got it? Izuku relaxed, his shoulders dropping as he smiled softly. The Omega nodded and walked into the room with Katsuki bringing up the rear. The room went wild with his entrance, the dissonance of camera CLCKs seemingly never ending. Unlike with the paparazzi, the photographers kept their distance and the reporters held their tongues. Still, Izuku had never felt the spotlight so intensely hot on his skin. Once on stage, Izuku didn't know where to go exactly. He stared at the long table with microphones set up in confusion, so he was thankful for Kirishima motioning to the chair in front of him with his eyes. It was probably there for the pro hero, since Izuku wasn't meant to be on stage, but the Omega took it anyway so that Katsuki could sit in one of the center chairs next to him on Izuku's right. In his seat, he felt a hand nudge his left thigh. He glanced down and saw a pink hand, palm side up. Izuku glanced up to Mina's reassuring smile and took the offered hand in a seizing grip before turning forward to the crowd. Welcome pro heroes, press, and those watching at home. Sir Night-Eye came off as surprisingly charismatic, while still maintaining his usual commanding persona. We ask that you come today to address the controversies surrounding a complaint received several days ago in regards to one of Plus Ultra's pro heroes. We appreciate your patience until now. Without further introduction, Ground Zero, the hero named in the complaint, will make a statement. Izuku had been so fixated on the greedy sea of reporters that he didn't see that Katsuki had pulled out a piece of paper. As Izuku watched his mate smooth out the script, he couldn't help but wonder when he had time to write one, considering the Alpha had never left his side since their reunion. Actually, Izuku was more surprised that the man had a script. Katsuki had been so certain, so confident in what they were about to do, but the scratched-out words and holes in the paper didn't lie. Kacchan was nervous. I'm Katsuki Bakugo, Ground Zero, as if you didn't know. There's been a lot of... Katsuki paused, his jaw moving sideways in frustration, in restraint. Talk about me, a lot of people questioning my actions, all from a part of a complaint but, associate wrote. I've read the whole complaint, and while some of the points they made were flat out wrong, the sentiment rang true. I, Katsuki Bakugo, screwed up. The Alpha looked up from his paper, pressing it into the table with his bad hand. Intention and follow-up don't matter when you do something wrong for a selfish reason. In order to keep my job, I took advantage of someone else. Red eyes turned away from the crowd to hold Izuku's stunned gaze. This hadn't been part of the plan. For that I am sorry. I'm sorry I dragged you into this mess with my bad decisions. I am sorry that I didn't listen to you since the start, but I can't say I'm sorry that I did it. If I could do it again, I would. Katsuki turned back to the crowd of reporters, ignoring the cameras that had started up another flurry of flashes. I was feeling so and guilty that my plan for this press talk was to announce my resignation. The room instantly became louder as people muttered to each other eagerly, likely already writing headlines in their heads. Kacchan had to raise his voice to be heard, even with the microphone. At least that was my intention. Just as quickly, the room fell silent. But this so-called controversy isn't just about me now, is it? And contrary to what many of you have been saying, I'm not making decisions on my own. As fine as I was with resigning, this guy, Katsuki, leaned forward on the table and pointed an accusing finger in Izuku's direction, wouldn't let me. Instead, he decided that he's had enough of this CRP and wants to explain things for himself. The alpha's head turned to Izuku, his smirk somehow encouraging and not challenging. Still, Izuku would have appreciated a better introduction, or at least one that didn't leave him blushing like a schoolgirl. But maybe that was asking too much of the situation. No matter what Kacchan had said, Izuku would have felt the same paralyzing apprehension regardless. This was what Izuku had asked for, however. This was what he had to do if he wanted change. But again, half a dozen camera flashes went off and Izuku let go of Mina's reassuring hand to anxiously wring own hands together in his lap. He wished he had a paper or something to hold like Kacchan, but after going back and forth on the idea, he'd opted not to bring one. With all the practice last night, he'd memorized his speech anyway. My name is Katsuki Bakugo and I'm Ground Zero's mate. Reporters frantically wrote in their notebooks or tapped away at tablets, momentarily distracting the skittish Omega. Izuku took in a deep breath, concentrating on his words instead of the people in front of him. Only that's not all that I am. I'm not just Ground Zero's mate, I am not, as the news have referred to me, unnamed male Omega. And I lied to you all just right now because my name is not really Katsuki. Before Katsuki approached me in a jail cell with a crazy proposition only a couple of months ago, I didn't have a name. I lost the right to my real name, first because of someone else, and eventually of my own volition. By the time I was arrested, I had died, been sold into mating, lived on the streets, kidnapped, and then sold again, this time into Pirtin. The murmurs in the crowd didn't faze Izuku this time, his back straight and his voice strong as he continued. Honestly, I lived a pretty miserable existence before Katsuki came into my life. And while it may seem like the situation I was in before left me no choice but to agree to be Ground Zero's mate, for the first time ever, I have chosen to be here. I have chosen to share my name and my background because the sad fact is that I, and others like me, don't get very many chances to choose. When I was 14, I presented as an Omega. By the time I finished my first heat, my father had chosen to sell my hand in marriage to pay off his own debts. I didn't choose to be an Omega, but because my father was my father, an Alpha trusted without question because of his own presentation, I lived a hellish lifestyle for 5 years. And the worst part is, the government knew all about it. On paper, I became a 19-year-old male Omega, whose name is unimportant in the eyes of the law, who was mated without protest. The money that exchanged hands was just another dowry. But you won't find my signature on any marriage license, because the signature of an Omega, the consent of the other participant in a legally binding contract, isn't required. Examples like this, where Omega somehow lack the same rights and protections as their fellow classes, are everywhere. Even Omega who risk their lives to keep us safe, who train for years and achieve several licenses on their own to qualify as pro-heroes, are then suddenly treated as inferior to others and are required to register as a hero duo with an Alpha to keep their careers. Unfortunately, this is true for every class. Many jobs require Alpha and Beta to find partners, mates, of their own in order to keep their job. Family planning and VampireGaaraCheesepuffs have been functionally banned through the government making certain methods illegal. Slowly, but surely, the government has taken away all of our capability to make decisions that affect our day-to-day lives. Take it from someone who didn't have control over his own life for a very, very long time. We can't let this keep happening. If you haven't felt the effects up until now, I promise you, someone out there, someone vulnerable, someone powerless due to a situation not of their own causing, is already suffering. Izuku took a deep breath. Someone like me. For once the room was quiet. Cameras stayed dark, still trained on Izuku. Hands rested tensely on reporters' laps. And while the tension in the room had reached its peak, Izuku finally felt his strained muscles loosen and an all-encompassing sensation of calm washed over him as if he'd stepped into a warm shower after a long day. To answer the questions you all came here to ask today, yes, Ground Zero and I became mated under unusual circumstances. No, he did not do so without my consent. He asked me first, and I agreed. Yes, I was aware that Katsuki came to me because he was running out of time to find a mate and feared losing his job. Izuku turned to smile sheepishly at Kacchan. Also might have only agreed to the proposal so I wouldn't have to go to jail. But, Izuku turned back to the crowd, that decision ended up being one of the best choices of my life, one that I wouldn't change for the world. As such, Katsuki and I will not be terminating our marriage license, and Ground Zero will not be resigning because the only time he abused his position of power, as the media has been saying, was coming to visit me after visiting hours to speak to me, to give me a choice. The Omega looked up and down the table anxiously, avoiding direct eye contact with any of the other occupants' eyes. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you for your time. The room exploded. Whatever spell had lulled the crowd into a dazed silence lifted without warning. Hands shut up, accompanied by several people calling out at Suki in various pitches. Izuku's eyes darted across the sea of hands, suddenly unsure what to do next. Shut up. Katsuki barked into the microphone. The alpha didn't quite earn the silence he sought, but the room quieted enough for Izuku to hear himself think again. One at a time. You, Katsuki pointed at a random reporter in the front row, speak. Itsuki, the reporter stood up, holding her phone as far in front of her as she could. If that's not your real name, what is? Oh, Izuku blinked in surprise at the simple question. It's Izuku. My name used to be Izuku Midoriya, but I guess now it's Izuku Bakugo. Demonstrate. Kacchan whispered under his breath, only loud enough to make Izuku blush in embarrassment, before loudly saying, Itsuki, Izuku, the Omega corrected. Izuku, you admitted that Ground Zero came to you in the first place to avoid losing his job and that you agreed to get out of your prison sentence. Do you not think that both of you should be punished for trying to game the system? What we did wasn't illegal. Yes, but doesn't it set a dangerous precedent? Exactly, Izuku calmly responded. Why can any Omega suddenly get a lighter sentence if there's an Alpha around to vouch for them? Why can any Alpha come in and suddenly offer to vouch for someone that's basically a stranger? Katsuki and I were mated in less than a week, with little background or information on my end. Why did the marriage office approve us? Another reporter stood up. Are you suggesting that we give Omega harsher sentences? No, not at all. I'm saying that they should be treated fairly. They should be able to post bail just as an Alpha or a Beta might. And if not, be placed in a jail with dangerous Alpha. That's the case anyway. If you're so worried for an Omega's safety, then maybe you should be concerned for the safety of all our prisoners and we should re-evaluate our prison system too. Mr. Bakugou. Izuku tried to keep his face professional at being addressed using Katsuki's last name. Yeah, he said it was his name, but saying it and hearing it were two different beasts entirely. You keep saying that things need changing, but I've yet to hear you give us any concrete plans or, that's where we come in. Mina interrupted in her ever-cheery voice, amplified by her own microphone. And by we, I mean all of us. The public's concern and outrage in response to the complaint was amazing, even if this particular case was a bad example of exploitation. Which is why we want to start an organization to guide everyone's energies to maximize change. Izuku added. It's called the Alliance of Secondary Genders for Equality and we need your support. Kirishima leaned over his mate's shoulder to speak into her microphone. The paperwork to be recognized as an official organization has already been submitted. Plus, every pro-hero in this room has already signed on as members. That statement earned itself some more chatter amongst the crowd. Technically, it was a lie, seeing as neither Sir Night Eye nor the number 1 hero duo had been invited to sign. unsure whether they'd stop the small group from hijacking the press conference for such a bold political statement. If you're interested, we've set up a website that you can join. Mina pulled out a sign with the website domain that she and Kirishima had been instructed to hide under the table earlier that day. Anyone and everyone is encouraged to join. Donate your time, money, or simply stay informed so that you know how you can help in the future. Once again, all the reporters began to raise their hands in questions, but Sir Night-Eye finally intervened. I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have for this statement. On behalf of Plus Ultra Hero Agency, we stand by our heroes and all their heroic efforts. Thank you. With that, Sir Night-Eye stood, signaling for the other pro-heroes and Izuku to follow suit. The cameras were still rapidly taking photos, but Izuku was lost in thought. Once outside in the hallway, Izuku quickly caught up to Sir Night-Eye, who was swiftly leaving. Were you aware we were going to do that? Make a statement. Sir Night-Eye didn't even pause. My quirk is foresight. It would have been negligent on my part not to know what was going to happen in my own press conference. Izuku stopped walking, allowing Sir Night-Eye to disappear further down the hall. Did that really just happen? Did Sir Night-Eye approve of what they'd just done? At the very least he didn't stop them. The thought made Izuku smile wider than he knew he could. Pivoting on his heel, Izuku began to walk back toward the rest of the group who were talking loudly in their excitement. All except Katsuki, whose eyes were trained on Izuku. When their gazes met, Kacchan smirked knowingly and Izuku's heart fluttered in his ear. Whatever this feeling was, Izuku only got it when he was with Kacchan. Year later. Are you ready yet? We're going to be late, nerd. I'm trying to go as fast as I can. Izuku stared at his sorry excuse of a tie around his neck in the bathroom mirror before sighing in frustration, undoing the knot for the 10th time that afternoon. Why were these stupid things so difficult? You have until after I feed the fish, and then I'm leaving your butt here. The Omega froze, holding one end of the tie in each hand. What? Kacchan, I already fed the fish. Loud swearing could be heard from the other side of the apartment, and Izuku dropped one end of the tie to pinch the bridge of his nose with his index and forefinger. He'd put up a fuss when Katsuki had refused to get a pet, claiming that neither of them knew the first thing about taking care of a living creature. They'd compromised by agreeing to work their way up the pet hierarchy, but they'd only just graduated from plant to fish a month ago. At this rate, Izuku would never get his bunny. Once Izuku removed his hand from his face, he studied his reflection. He had to admit, he'd begun to look almost normal, if that was possible. The scars would stop that from ever being entirely true, but he'd begun to recognize himself again. His hair had grown out long ago, leaving an uncontrollable green mop of hair on the top of his head with no traces of the dyes he'd once used religiously. To Izuku's chagrin, his cheeks had somehow gained more so-called baby fat, probably just a sign of him reaching a healthy body weight, making him look younger than his age even if his eyes hinted otherwise. Izuku blinked rapidly before leaning into the mirror to stare at his cheeks more closely. Were those his freckles? How the hell did those come back? When did they come back? Is this why we're gonna be f***ing late? Izuku jumped away from the mirror at the sound of his annoyed mates. Because you can't get enough of your reflection. And they say I'm full of myself. Normally, Izuku would send some sharp comment back, but instead he smiled at Kacchan's smug reflection sheepishly. No, we're going to be late because your Omega never learned how to tie a tie. The pro-hero, dressed in his hero outfit, save his oversized gauntlets, rolled his eyes. I told you not to wear the monkey suit. Not all of us have an amazing hero suit to wear. Then just be f***ing comfortable, it's not like you're speaking. But we're still standing on stage. Katsuki shook his head but then grabbed Izuku by the shoulder to turn him toward the pro-hero. The alpha grabbed the ends of the tie, skillfully going to work to tie it. Izuku smiled. What would I do without you? Probably die of starvation. Your cooking sucks. It's better. It's inedible. Which is better? Izuku watched his mate work on the tie, fixating on his left hand. He'd still never gained complete function of all his fingers, but he used it so seamlessly it was easy to forget that he'd injured it. I love you, Kacchan, Izuku whispered, still unused to the word in his mouth. I know that, stupid Deku. Katsuki muttered, but Izuku didn't miss the way his hands paused when Izuku said it. Kacchan was a great liar to everyone but him. Now hurry up, the alpha finished tightening the tie, everyone's waiting on you. Wait, when did everyone get here? While you were in here f***ing your reflection. Kacchan. I was not. Stop your sputtering and let's get out of here. Katsuki turned and left the bathroom, Izuku following close behind, the blush still hot on his cheeks. Sure enough, the living room was a full house. Uraraka cheered, spinning herself on the arm-rest to face Izuku. He answered her with an awkward smile, rubbing the back of his head warily. We were getting worried about you. Kirishima smiled, showing off his sharp teeth. Oh, you look so handsome. Mina swooned, shaking her mate's shoulders. I can't believe this is happening. After today, no Omega will have to get a hero partner to become a pro-hero. We did it. Izuku's smile faltered. I can't believe it took a year and we've only gotten this far. There's still so much left to change. None of that. Mitsuki exited the kitchen, her husband in tow. Izuku stood up straighter as his mother-in-law made her way over to him. Even after all this time, he was still intimidated of his auntie. When the female alpha reached him, she placed her hands on either side of his face, squeezing his cheeks with very little pressure. Her strong expression suddenly softened. If your mother could see you now, she'd be so proud of you, Izuku. We're all so proud of you. Izuku swore he wasn't the crybaby that Katsuki claimed he was, but it was impossible to not stare into the teary eyes of his new mother figure and not tear up himself. All he could do was nod and accept the bone-breaking hug. Are you two done ballin' yet? We're already late. Mitsuki pulled away from her son-in-law to glare daggers at her own son. We were having a moment, brat. At least Izuku listens to what I have to say. Are you saying I don't listen, Hag? Bakugou. That is no way to speak to your own mother. Ida stood up from the seat next to Uraraka, arms chopping through the air. But we really must be going or else we'll miss the signing ceremony. Somehow Ida was successful in getting the ragtag crew out of the condo and into their respective cars. Izuku sat in the back seat of Kacchan's parents' car, his hand intertwined with his mate's. Eventually he turned to look at Katsuki before leaning over to rest his head on the alpha's shoulder. Katsuki's eyes glanced away from the window to look at his mate without moving his head from where it rested on his palm, before turning back to look out the window. Stop thinking so strong. But what if this is as far as we get? Don't be stupid, you're not going to quit, so we're not done, got it? Izuku hummed, uncertain, but Katsuki ignored him. You decide what universities to apply to. Izuku flinched at that. I don't know if I even want to go. Really? A nerd like you is turning down more school. The Omega frowned. I don't know if I really need it to achieve what I want. The Alliance takes up so much of my time. But it's okay, I still have time to think about it. You only have 2 more subjects before you have your high school equivalency certificate. You'll have to decide then. A hand came up to land in Izuku's hair, tousling it comfortingly. Whatever you choose, I'll be here. Izuku smiled, turning his head to bury his face into his mate's shoulder. Eventually the car came to a stop and Izuku had to pull away. He turned to look out his window, staring at the crowd gathered outside the large legislature building. Let's go change society. No one told Izuku there'd be an after-party. He definitely didn't expect everyone to get drunk so quickly, either. Someone, likely Mina, had invited all of Kacchan's hero class to the private backroom of a high-end bar downtown, a luxury that the group of high-ranking pro-heroes could afford, but left Izuku uncomfortable regardless. The private part was key because things had already gotten wild. Mina and Kaminari had climbed a table to dance and were promptly getting yelled at by Ida to get down. Momo and Yuri were gushing over Jiru's new baby photos, all with red faces and slurred sentences at one end of the bar. At the other end, Aoyama had attracted a strangely feminine crowd consisting of Hagakure, Tsu, Habuko, Hatsum, and Sato's wife, Aiko. Either Aoyama was funnier when tipsy, or all the girls were a few drinks too deep because their laughter carried all the way to Izuku's seat in one of the booths across the room. The only clearer conversation in the room was from the booth next to his, where the majority of Kacchan's classmates sat, sharing hero stories loudly. The only people left unaccounted for were occupying one of the standing tables in Izuku's line of sight. There, Uraraka was currently in an intense arm wrestling match with Katsuki, with Kirishima acting as referee and likely waiting to challenge the winner. Izuku knew that he should get up and join one of the groups. He could cheer his mate on or maybe find out what was so DMN funny. But, even with so much to celebrate, Izuku couldn't help but feel uncomfortable, unworthy. The Omega took another sip of the same amaretto sour he'd been nursing the entire evening. Even though he'd started to drink, he hadn't acquired the taste for beer and stayed away from anything that tasted strongly of alcohol. Congratulations. Izuku looked up from his drink to smile at Shoto as he took a seat at Izuku's booth. Shouldn't I be congratulating you, mister? Number 2. I would think you'd be doing the opposite considering I took your mate's position. Todoroki turned to watch Katsuki slam Ochiko's hand into the table. I imagine he was upset. Furious. The Omega laughed, earning him the smallest smile from the pro hero. But it's no surprise. You've become a real powerhouse in the last 6 months. How does it feel to finally be using your fire? Different. Izuku snorted. That's all. Shoto shrugged. Tonight's not about me. It's about you and your group's accomplishment. At that, Izuku sighed, staring at Ida being pulled on the table now that Siro had taped his arms to his sides. Everyone is so excited, but I just can't be. Don't take this the wrong way. I'm extremely happy that we finally got the Pro Hero Law passed and now 18-year-old Omegas won't have to make career-impacting decisions so young. Booty thought the alliance would have made a greater impact by now. Mating clauses are still a thing. BRTHCNTRL is still illegal. I feel like I made promises I couldn't keep. Todoroki took a lengthy drink of his ginger ale, looking over Izuku from top to bottom. So you're saying that the alliance was a mistake? What? Izuku jumped in his seat. No, of course, that all those protests Mina organized were useless. No, I and my wife's lobbying efforts had no impact. Of course then all the programs and support services you set up for Omegas in need should be terminated. I could pull my family's donation. Izuku half shouted. I get it. The Alpha's blank expression didn't change, but his voice was far quieter when he spoke. Change doesn't happen all at once. Instead of focusing on what more there is to do, think of all the people whose lives you've already changed. As a smart person once told me, let yourself be happy, Izuku. Izuku looked up to see Kacchan now arm wrestling Kirishima with Ochiko egging Kirishima on from the sidelines. His mate briefly looked up, their eyes making contact from across the room. Suddenly Katsuki's arm went down, prompting both Kirishima and Ochiko to throw their arms into the air in a victory cheer. Izuku smiled. Thanks Shoto, you're right. Todoroki glanced over at Katsuki, noticing the sustained eye contact between him and Izuku. The number 2 hero grabbed his drink and shimmied his way out of the booth. Don't forget, Soichi's birthday party is next Sunday. Wouldn't miss it. Izuku called after Todoroki. At the midway point of the room, Kacchan and Shoto ran into each other. Something must have been said because Katsuki was suddenly scowling by the time he made his way over to Izuku. Get up, nerd. Izuku blinked in confusion. Stop asking questions. Just shut up and follow me. Quickly, Izuku scooted out of the booth, leaving his drink behind. To his surprise, Katsuki led them toward the exit, bringing them back into the main bar area. It was a struggle to keep up with his mate with all the other patrons milling around, but Izuku managed somehow. The surprises kept coming, however, because Katsuki led them through a big metal door and to the back alley of the bar. Izuku looked around the trash-filled corridor with a frown. What are we doing out here, Kacchan? Instead of answering, the Alpha suddenly propelled himself upwards with a well-controlled explosion from his left hand. Despite being used to Kacchan's quirk, Izuku still squeaked in surprise, covering his head without thinking. The screeching grind of metal on metal made the Omega drop his hands and look again. Where once there was nothing, there was suddenly a metal ladder leading up to the building's fire escape. Get to climbing, scaredy-cat. Izuku stuck his tongue out at his mate as he walked over to the ladder. While the inside of the bar had been newly renovated in a modern style, the building was one of the few left in the neighborhood that was not a sleek high-rise. In fact, The way the metal fire escape creaked under Izuku's feet led him to believe that the building was even older than it looked. The pair climbed flight after flight of stairs, slowly making their way up the still tall structure. Thank goodness Izuku was in shape. Eventually, they made it to the last landing where another ladder led to the roof. A quick glance at Katsuki answered Izuku's unasked question and he ascended that, too. Once on the roof, Izuku inhaled sharply. Izuku had always loved cityscapes, but views like this were rare. Unlike the rooftop restaurants they'd visited or the other views from the surrounding high-rises, the men were high enough to see the architecture of the surrounding buildings but also low enough to make out the figures of individual cars and people going about their evening. Without thinking, Izuku walked closer to the edge, leaning forward to watch a couple pointing at the window of a closed clothing store. The man must have said something because the girl on his arm playfully swatted him before dragging them both away. Izuku laughed. It felt nice, being so distant yet still feeling like he was part of the city. How do you always find the best views? I know everything. Right, that's it. Izuku turned to roll his eyes at his mate. Katsuki smirked and walked over to Izuku to take a seat on the edge of the building, legs dangling off the edge dangerously. This is part of my patrol route. It's a nice place to sit on a break. Izuku lowered himself to sit cross-legged, still leaning forward to stare at the people. Did you need a break now? Izuku asked as he watched a car speed through a stoplight. Katsuki didn't respond, prompting the Omega to look up with worried eyes. Is something wrong, Kacchan? I didn't bring you up here for nothing. The Alpha slowly answered. I wanted to talk to you about something. Izuku could feel his heart attempting to beat through his Katsuki grunted. Yeah, and this isn't easy to say, so you better not interrupt me. If Izuku was anxious before, now he was downright terrified. Still, he forced himself to nod. His mate sighed before jerking his head away and growling. 10 years ago I realized I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Izuku's breath caught in his throat but Katsuki didn't notice. I said something that made me lose the only person I actually gave a FCK about, and I didn't even know it at the time. Once you were gone, there was no one, and I mean no one, who deserved my attention, let alone someone who could compete with me. Because that's what you were for me. My competition. When I looked at you, I saw a goddamn weakling who was more of a hero than I could ever dream to become. You never had to think about it. You stepped in to be a hero without worrying about if you were going to win or lose. 1 year ago, you told me that I had fallen in love with an image of you of my own creation. You were f***ing wrong, of course, because the memories of you that I loved, your selflessness, your audacity, your resilience, were nothing compared to the real thing. After all these years and all that bullshit the world put you through, you didn't change, Deku. And that's what I love about you. Katsuki turned farther away from Izuku, head down as he did something with his hands. When he turned back around, he grabbed Izuku's wrist to drag the other man's hand toward him. Izuku felt something soft press into his palm. Happy birthday, Izuku blinked in confusion. My birthday's not till tomorrow, Kacchan. The Alpha made a TCH sound by clicking his tongue. It is tomorrow, idiot. Izuku blushed, not realizing how late it had gotten. He looked down at his hand for the first time, his eyes widening at the sight of the black velvet box. Quickly, he opened it using his other hand, revealing a simple gold band. But Kacchan, we're already married. What the FCK? Katsuki's face turned completely red. If you don't f***ing want it, I'll take it back. No. Izuku quickly leaned away, holding the ring box out of Katsuki's reach. I love it. I love you. Katsuki stopped reaching for the box and smirked. That's more like it, stupid Deku. Izuku pulled the ring out of its box and held it up to Katsuki. Put it on me. The Alpha scoffed, but took the ring anyway before slowly sliding it on his mate's left ring finger. Once on, Katsuki interlaced his fingers with his mate's, squeezing them together before pulling Izuku toward him into an embrace. Tears began to drip from Izuku's eyes as he kissed his mate, his Kacchan. Katsuki must have felt the tears against his cheeks because he deepened the embrace. Even with the sticky, salted tears, Izuku could only feel the press of Kacchan's lips, taste the hint of cinnamon whiskey on the other man's tongue. When they finally parted for air, Izuku laughed breathlessly. After everything that happened, after being apart for so long, What were the chances that you'd ask me of all people to be your mate without even knowing who I was? Don't get sappy on me with tea about destiny or fate, Deku. You're the one who got all sappy first. Well, I'm not the one crying right now, am I? Katsuki whispered, reaching out his left hand to wipe away one of the tear tracks on Izuku's cheek with his thumb. Izuku could feel the cool sensation of metal on his skin, and the Omega realized that his mate was wearing a ring too. I really love you, Katsuki. I loved you first. Katsuki rushed home from patrol. Not that his rushing was particularly unusual, especially on days where he was getting home later than he would have liked. Today was one of those days, but not for the usual reason of having to do shitty paperwork. He'd instead made a pit stop on the way home, and that stop had him even more excited to get home to his mate. The Alpha's excitement quickly turned to dread. A crash echoed down the hallway the second Katsuki stepped out of the elevator onto his floor. Not a breath later, he barreled down the hallway, paper house bouncing against his right leg a bit too harshly. He swore when he realized this and did his best to steady the cardboard as he came to a stop in front of the door to his condo. On second thought, Katsuki slowly placed the box on the ground to the side of the door. That gave him free rein to yank his keys out of his pockets, unlock the door at record speed, and throw it open with a resounding Izuku. What a sight greeted him. Their kitchen table, now visible from the front door, sat on its side, chairs strewn to one side like forgotten toys. Broken plates and bowls littered the once perfectly maintained wooden floor, a floor that was now stained with food and some kind of sticky dark liquid. And hanging over the edge of the table, frozen as if a movie put on pause, was his Omega, gripping some kind of tannish, blonde, fuzzy creature that stared back at Katsuki with concerningly perceptive chestnut eyes. Katsuki didn't even mean to, but he held the eyes of the animal for another full second before he finally spoke. What the FCK is that? Another beat of silence passed, and then Izuku gave a wobbly smile. Surprise. The world unpaused. The little thing in Izuku's hands suddenly sprang to life. Wriggling back and forth, kicking with both of its strong bottom legs, the rabbit gave everything it had in an attempt to escape. Izuku yelped in surprise as he too began to wiggle, trying to both keep the rabbit in his grasp and to not fall face first over the table and into the pile of broken porcelain below. Again, Katsuki's protective instincts kicked in. He stalked down the hallway, work boots still on, so that he could take the rabbit from his mate with one hand and push Izuku off the table and onto his feet with the other. Surprised me. What the hell is this thing, and where did you? Katsuki yelled when the rabbit bit the sensitive skin on the back of his hand. The Alpha dropped the rabbit without thought and it bolted to the wide open door. Kacchan, the door. Katsuki was fast, but not that fast. He did the only thing he could do to stop the mongrel from escaping the scene of the crime. The Alpha let off a small explosion at the front door, the pressure of which closed it shut with a snap right in front of the rabbit and left scorch marks all up the back of it. The rabbit didn't seem to care. Escape route now gone, it turned and fled into the kitchen. Katsuki took off after it, but when he walked in he saw nothing. Where'd it go? Izuku joined him a second later and anxiously bit at the pad of his thumb. Shoot, not again. Katsuki enunciated slowly, jaw working back and forth with growing aggravation. He likes to hide. His mate turned to meet Katsuki's accusing glare and gave yet another awkward smile. Then the mumbling started. Well, you said we'd finally graduated to Bunny, so I began to look online at the local shelters, and let me tell you, there's not many rabbit rescue groups in the area. I had to take 4 buses to pick him up, each way. And there were a couple of other rabbits, but they were all with fosters. GZ was the only one there because he was harder to place. What did you just call him? Izuku blinked, then his smile became much softer. I thought the name, Ground Zero, fit well. Katsuki growled, how fking so? Let's see. He's fast and smart and cute. Izuku counted out each point on his fingers, and I mean, did you look at him? The resemblance is uncanny. Uncanny, my butt. There's nothing similar about us. He's a rabbit. The look Izuku gave him suggested otherwise. Katsuki threw his hands into the air. I can't believe you got the thing in the first place. Wrong thing to say. All hints of a smile fell from Izuku's face as pure stubbornness pooled into his eyes. His husband crossed his arms against his seat. Well, Someone wasn't supposed to stay at work late today and could have come with me. Katsuki averted his eyes. And, Izuku continued, that same someone didn't answer his texts all day. Katsuki didn't lose often, but he was smart enough to know when to surrender. He gave a long sigh as he turned away from the kitchen and headed back to the front door. He could feel Izuku hovering close by, surely watching his every move as Katsuki opened the door and retrieved the cardboard box he'd left in the hall. Surprise! The sight of the box made Izuku's eyes grow wide. Is that? Izuku didn't finish his sentence. Instead, he ran over and took the box from Katsuki's grasp. The Omega sank down to the floor with the box and opened it with shaking hands. Katsuki couldn't see the tiny rabbit with light gray, floppy ears and gray-green mittens and a heart around its left eye. But he could see the tears well up in his husband's eyes when he saw her. Warmth traveled through Katsuki's tea, a purr bubbled up his vocal cords. This was the reaction Katsuki had anticipated, that he'd dreamed of all day long. Now, he swallowed bitterness. I've been in contact with the breeder for a while now. Today she was finally old enough to pick up. Izuku whispered. Yeah, Katsuki sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Didn't think you'd beat me to it. I'm sure I can take her back. What? Izuku's head shot upward, eyes unbelieving. Take her back? You can't do that. Then we're taking back the monster. Then what the hell, Ade? We'll keep both. Now it was Katsuki that gave an incredulous stare. But we have to. We don't have to do SHT. The whole point of going up the hierarchy was to make sure we weren't getting in over our heads. It took us 2 years to get to Rabbit, and now you want 2 of them. Katsuki took one look at Izuku and knew what came next. No, don't you fking dare. Don't you dare use those puppy eyes. But Kacchan, no buts. Besides, what if the 2 little fkers don't get along? Then what? Out of nowhere and probably out of pure spite, a flash of tan crossed the hall and disappeared into the open cardboard container. Izuku squeaked in surprise. Katsuki rushed forward to stop the little devil. Both reactions went unnoticed by the rabbits. The 2 sniffed each other briefly before the larger GZ curled itself around the smaller rabbit and both closed their eyes. Izuku smiled brightly, shiny eyes again on Katsuki. What's her name? Katsuki tilted his head back toward the ceiling in defeat. It's Suki. I promise we can do this. Izuku couldn't do this. They'd warned him, boy. Had they warned him? The lady running the rescue had warned that GZ had been returned 3 times from different foster homes. At the time, that made Izuku all the more determined. Rabbits with bad habits were inherently harder to place in a forever home. They had too much baggage. Izuku knew a lot about baggage. He thought he could finally repay the favor and give this animal in need of a good home the love and security it deserved. Ground Zero, the rabbit, did not have the same plan. All GZ seemed to care about was escaping. No matter how Izuku modified the giant hutch he and Kacchan had bought their new rabbits, GZ got out. And where he went, GZ left a trail of destruction in his wake. He knocked things off the table. Gnawed at the legs of tables and chairs. Not to mention the noise. Sometimes Izuku could hear him scratching at a door in the middle of the night as if he were trying to dig a tunnel to freedom. Izuku thought he just needed time. Time and patience and lots of cuddles and treats that would show him how much Izuku loved him. But months had passed and GZ still tried to escape at least 3 times a week. As if that weren't bad enough, Itsuki was perfect and she loved Kacchan. She instantly knew when Kacchan arrived home and began to pace in her hutch. When he walked into the living room, she'd even begin to honk with excitement. Unlike GZ, Itsuki never went far when let out of the hutch. She followed Kacchan wherever he went or was usually content to sit on a pillow they'd set out by the couch. Itsuki was the model pet. Izuku heard scratching and looked up from the protest sign he was painting. He gave out a loud sigh at the sight of the open hutch door and Itsuki lying on her pillow. There was no point in standing up to stop GZ from scratching at the front door. Experience taught Izuku that he would tire out eventually or get bored and mess with something else. Besides, he still had at least 5 more signs to make before tomorrow's march. They were quickly approaching the Alliance's 3rd anniversary, and there was still work to do. After Omegan Pro Hero licenses were secured, the Alliance had targeted and gotten marriage clauses removed from all government contracts. They lobbied, and were successful in most cases, for their removal at most private companies too. What they had no luck with were BRTH-Cientral rights. Any and all forms of hormonal BRTH-Cientral methods, the majority of Omega-controlled BRTH-Cientral options, were still illegal. Legislators refused to budge, constantly defending their concern for public health. Condoms were available, they said, but condoms were still ultimately in the hands of the alpha in most couples. Not helpful in terms of Omegan autonomy and control. Some days, Izuku wondered if his battle would ever end. If things would ever change entirely for Omegas or if he'd ultimately never live up to his promises. He bit at his lower lip as he underlined the word now on his latest sign. Izuku leaned back from his knees to plop down on his butt. He closed his eyes and took in a deep breath to silence the nagging thoughts scratching the inside of his head. The scratching. GZ's scratching had stopped. The Omega opened his eyes and locked gazes with GZ. The rabbit was sitting on his latest sign, paws smearing the still fresh red paint. Izuku froze. Ground zero. The rabbit's ears twitched back and forth, and then it took off. Izuku jumped to his feet, but he was no match for GZ's speed. The rabbit ran circles around Izuku's legs, leaving a network of paw prints on the signs and floor. Then he knocked over the whole tub of paint, which Izuku quickly spun around to mop up when he heard a squeal of pain. He looked down and realized he'd stepped on the edge of Itsuki's pillow, and by the look of fear on her face, probably one of her long floppy ears. Oh no. Itsuki, baby. Izuku apologized profusely, but the rabbit wouldn't let him near her. She took off too, running right through the puddle of paint. Now there were footprints leading all the way to the bedroom. GZ took off after her. Izuku couldn't help it. Tears began to well up in his eyes. And of course that was when the front door opened. What did that? Izuku looked up from the carnage to see Katsuki's shocked expression turn concerned. Deku, what is going on? The floodgates opened. He spread his arms out around him. This is going on. Nothing is going as planned. 2 years we waited to get the soft, cuddly pets I've dreamed about all my life, and they hate me. They hate me. Itsuki doesn't hate you. Izuku snorted. She does right now. And GZ always hates me. That thing isn't but. He's our but. Ours. But he doesn't want to be ours. All he does is try to get away. Because he hates me. He hates me because I can't give him what he needs. I can't give him the home he deserves, and I can't keep all the promises I made 3 years ago, and I don't have a job other than my work with the Alliance, so I can't bring in any money of my own. And if I can't take care of a couple of rabbits, how would I be able to take care of our kids, which I doubt I can even have at this point? And what the FCK are you going on about, nerd? Izuku snapped his mouth shut. It had been a while since Kacchan had called him a nerd. He focused his eyes on a red paw print on the floor as he felt his husband come closer. Katsuki's hand was rough with calluses, save for the smooth scar in the center of his palm against Izuku's cheek. Izuku put his hand over Katsuki's and held it there. They stood in silence. Then Katsuki whispered, "Do you want kids?" He didn't have an answer. Maybe. Someday. The thought was a new one, very new. Izuku had been vehemently against getting P-Arginin-T, but that was before he'd fallen in love with Kacchan. Being in love with and feeling loved by Kacchan reminded Izuku of his mother sometimes. A family. Still, Izuku was hesitant to let himself imagine what it would be like to have a family with Katsuki. Male Omegas had extremely low BRT traits. They'd had unprotected EC more times than he could count, though never during a heat, and part of him assumed that children were an impossibility. Izuku finally looked up into Katsuki's eyes. He still had no words for his husband, but Katsuki nodded in understanding anyway. If it happens, it happens. You'd make a great parent, though. But that spawn of Satan hasn't escaped the apartment once. If that's not the feat of a great parent, I don't know what else is. At that, Izuku couldn't help but chuckle. He looked around them at the mess of a living room and then down at his clothes, which had also gotten paint on them at some point. Shoot, I like these pants. Kacchan's hand slid down Izuku's cheek, tracing his neck then arm before landing on his waist. He gripped at the material, his non-injured fingers dipping into the waistband to press against bare skin. The alpha leaned into Izuku's ear. Weren't these mine at some point? Izuku smiled coyly. I thought you liked me in your clothes. I like taking you out of them. Their lips found each other like it was their first time, clumsy and harsh. But they were not unsure. Izuku kissed Kacchan as if he'd never been kissed because each embrace felt new, thrilling and overwhelming in the exponential love that Kacchan seemed to have for him. Even after all these years and Izuku's pool of unending insecurity, Kacchan treated Izuku as something precious. He felt that in every embrace, and it never failed to take his breath away. The kisses got longer, their breaths shorter. Katsuki had both hands wrapped around Izuku's waist and Izuku had his fingers wrapped around locks of blonde hair. Izuku was the one that got them moving. They stepped on already ruined signs on their way to the bedroom. Izuku was a hamster at walking backward, and it thrilled him to drag his alpha along with him. He called the shots in the bedroom unless he told Katsuki to take control. The honeymoon PRD never seemed to pass them, and most of Katsuki's days off were spent as staycations in the bedroom. Today, Izuku wanted to be under Katsuki. He climbed backward onto the bed when he reached it, letting Kacchan pull away for a brief second to dig through the nightstand for a condom. Izuku's heat was coming up soon. Talk about children earlier aside, his I don't know didn't translate to let's try for a baby right now, so Izuku was glad that Kacchan still went for it. They were kissing again. Kissing and gasping, hands rubbing against clothes and bare skin. Then the clothes were gone. Kacchan's warm palms made Izuku imagine those red paw prints on the living room floor with the way they left a trail down his knee. Kacchan. Izuku spoke in a quick exhale. Please. The alpha answered with an embrace to the lone mark on the right side of Izuku's neck. His hands slid downward again, one hand gripping under Izuku's thigh, the other reaching out across the bed. Katsuki suddenly froze. He sat back. When he cut off, Izuku sat up. He turned at the waist and froze as well. GZ was sitting on the bed with the wrapped condom in his mouth. The three of them all stared at each other. Leave him. Izuku eventually whispered. That's the last one, Katsuki hissed under his breath. Ever so slowly, the alpha began to adjust his weight to get closer to the rabbit. Izuku swore he saw GZ smirk. The rabbit jumped from the bed in an appealing arc as Katsuki swore up a storm. Get back here, you overgrown rat. Kacchan. Izuku yelled after his naked husband as he chased after their rabbit. He sighed and flopped back onto the bed. As soon as he did, Itsuki appeared out of nowhere and settled on his knee. He petted her absent-mindedly. On second thought, two rabbits really was a bad idea.